thanks, Tim. I'm speechless. It's a hard act to follow, even if it is, in a way, mine. Thanks again, Tim, for nominating me for this award and all the co-nominators you had. And I thank the Geochemical Society for deciding to give me the award. I know that this is an extremely competitive award, and in many ways, I'm still sort of speechless about the whole thing. And very proud, actually, to receive this award, as well as it's a reminder that all of my geochemical heroes have been here before me, and it's wonderful to be able to sort of take a space just beside them as well. So thanks again. So it all starts for me here. 4 generations represented here. I'm the youngest, of course. This is my father, and he was the most important, very, very much the most important influence in my life. And I could go in lots of detail there, but I think that what I would like to say is that I was an intensely curious child. I think some would probably even say I was irritating. And I asked lots and lots of questions, and my dad always took the time to try to answer them, every single one. He was just amazing in that way. But despite all of that, if there was never any promise early on that I would amount to anything, because I'd like to show you my 5th grade report card. Name Donald. Do I listen carefully? No. Do I try hard? Sometimes. Do I work carefully? No. Do I follow directions? Sometimes. And do I pick after myself? Usually, yes. So some would argue things haven't changed very much since then. If we move forward in time, the person that really changed, I think, my life in terms of science more than anybody else was Bill Green from Miami University. I was a chemistry student at the time, and Bill taught a brilliant course in environmental chemistry and taught me that actually chemistry could be fun and that science could be fun, and he took me to Antarctica, which was a lot of fun, I can assure you that, where we had lots of fun playing music and horsing around, and even going for my first ice swim, which was also great. But I owe a debt of gratitude for Bill for getting me on the path. And then, of course, I can't say enough about my advisor, Bob Berner, who was a giant in the field, but a giant in many other ways as well. He taught me how to do science. He taught me about scholarship. He taught me so many things, and he was really the person that probably made me the scientist that I am today. So thanks, Bob. And he was also a previous Goldschmidt Prize award winner, of course. And then there were contemporaries at Yale. We Tim, you probably recognize yourself here, where we had a really fantastic group of contemporary students and colleagues that were there at the same time, who added to an atmosphere which at least I feel was perhaps even unique. So I learned from Bob, but I also learned from many of my co-students and contemporaries, and that was really a brilliant time in my career. So when I finished with Bob, I took a postdoc with Dave Demery at NASA, and this was also a transitional moment for me, because Dave was very interested in microbes and microbial ecology, and this was something that I was desperate to learn more about. So Dave not only introduced me to that through understanding microbial mats, but also introduced to me the element of time, because Dave was also very interested in applying information about modern microbial systems to Earth history. So Dave more than anybody else set me loose on that path. But then there was something that was pulling as well, and this doesn't apply so much to Dave, but maybe more to Bob. Bob was instrumental, of course, in developing the field of diagenesis, but Bob didn't really care so much about what microbes were, who they were, how they worked. He viewed them as catalysts, and for them they were contributing to rates of processes. But there was this voice from Denmark which was calling out to me, and it was saying that, Don, there's also an ecology to these microbes, and there's substrates that they're using, and these microbes have names. And this was something that I was very interested in, and luckily I got the opportunity to work with Bo Bakker Jorgensen, first as a postdoc and then later as a member of his newly developing team at the Max Planck Institute of Marine Microbiology. So Bo really taught me about microbial ecology and how that can then be used to explore Earth history problems. And then there are the champions. I've been very lucky in my career, of course, and one of the things that I've been lucky about is that early on in my career there were various people that for one reason or another decided that I was a person that was worth promoting, and they did that. And these include Andy Knoll and John Grotzinger and John Hayes and Carl Trikian, who's really spent, I think, an inordinate amount of their energy promoting me as a young scientist. And I could probably also say that I may not be here today without the support of these guys as well. Well, I moved to University of Southern Denmark, and it wasn't an obvious career move. Bob Berner at the time told me he thought I was committing academic suicide, but it was the right thing to do for the family. And luckily, early on, I was able to convince Bo Tomdrup on the left, and then later Ronnie Gluth, to join me in our endeavors to build a group there. And it's turned out to be just a magnificent scientific journey. I think we've built a group that we are very proud of course, and I think that we're recognized internationally for what we do. And to continue on, we've added other very, very, very brilliant scientists, Caroline Loscher and Beata to the group. So it's a group that has an old dynamic now and a developing dynamic, and a dynamic that makes my daily life really quite exciting. And then there's the group at PetroChina that I need to address. There's Xizhan Zhang's group, and there's Xiaomei on the left and Laishan on the right, of course, me and my daughter there. And I met these guys about 12 years ago, and I would say that my interactions with them from PetroChina has certainly changed the direction of my work over the last decade or so, and I've been grateful for their friendship and also their collegial relationships. And then there's my group, finally, at NB, the Center for Environmental and Biological Evolution. This is my own group at University of Southern Denmark, and it's a very exciting group. I love these guys. And these are the guys that really make my day exciting. And, you know, I wake up every morning, look forward to come in and work with this tremendous group of people. And then I've been also fortunate that I've had funding to do our work. Of course, we need money to do our work, and I've been very, very lucky in Denmark to have attracted funding from a variety of different agencies. And the ones that I would like to really note here would be the Danmarks Grundforskningsfond, the Danish National Research Foundation, the Velum Fund, and also the ERC, who have kept my work alive. So thanks again for this wonderful award. I'm touched and proud and grateful and a little bit overwhelmed by it all. Thanks. And now, Tim, you didn't realize this, but there's a switch and bait going on here. And that switch and bait is I'm not going to talk about what I said I was going to talk about. And I apologize to you who invited me to a session for something else, and I apologize to those in the audience who thought I was going to talk about something different. But I felt that what I was going to talk about is something you can read about anyway. It was going to be mainly a review, and I'd like to share with you some new ideas and be aware that this is really in process of development. So actually, any input would also be quite welcome. So instead of talking about life's evolution, I'm going to be talking about the evolution of the rock cycle in some ways through geologic time. So what we're going to be involved with today is understanding how soils actually ultimately make their way into the oceans, and they have some transient pathways involving distribution into river suspended sediments, into river bottom sediments, into floodplain sediments. And basically what we're trying to understand is how the rock cycle works in modern times and how it has worked over geologic time. And as you'll see, this is kind of cool because it interfaces many aspects of tectonics and biology and weathering and climate perhaps also. So it's hopefully a rich enough topic that many of you will find some interest in. And this is generated, sort of the discussion is generated from some relatively new analyses that we have developed. It's not new samples. Back when Tim was around, he might remember this, that I jumped into my old blue truck. Remember that? Yeah, my truck called Truck. Yeah, and we took a trip around much of the continental United States, collecting river sediments, particulates, suspended sediments, and bottom sediments. And I published a paper many years ago on some of that work, but we've just recently reanalyzed them for a full spectrum of elemental analyses. And combined with that is a growing database on the chemistry of marine sediments, which will be a complement to this. And what I want to do is to put the river chemistry in context of the soils from which the particles are derived. In order to do that, we look at the river basins from which the rivers are derived from, and we overlay that with a soil geochemical map, which has been developed by the United States Geological Survey, so we can compare the chemistry of the sediment particulates with the chemistry of the soils from which they're derived. And we'll just jump right into that. And here's an example from the Neuse River. This is probably one of the better examples for what I would like to explain, but anyway, what you can see on here is a frequency diagram of course, there's a bunch of elements represented here, and you can see a frequency diagram, hopefully, maybe not so easily in the back, but frequency diagram of the elemental compositions from the different soil analyses in the river basins from the USGS. And you can see various lines there, and the dotted black line is the average from the soils, and the green line is the composition of suspended sediments, and the red line is the composition of bottom sediments. And what we see here is that for almost every element in this particular case, there is a much closer relationship between the chemistry of the soils and the chemistry of the bottom sediments. The chemistry of the suspended sediments are something very much different. And that turns out to be the case for most of the rivers that I look at. And one way of understanding that is through calculation of something that I would call a similarity index. And what this index does is it compares the similarity of the soils to those of both the suspended and bottom sediment particulates. And it's a very simple relationship. So what we do is we just take the difference between the soil and the river chemical particles, either suspended or bottom, and we compare that to the maximum concentration that we have of either the soil particulates or the river, and we get an index. If the index is 0, then that means that the chemistries are identical. If the index is 0.5, that means that the chemistry of the least abundant element, and the chemistry of the least abundant element is half of the more abundant elements, and so forth. You sort of asymptotes to 1. So what I do is I calculate a similarity index for all of the elements that we have in the different databases, and then I average them. And if I do that, we can get a similarity index calculation for all of the rivers. And I'm sure this is very difficult to see for many, but the point is that except for one case, the similarity of the bottom sediments is always closer to the soils than for the suspended sediments. So the soils have a very more similar relationship to the soils than the suspended sediments. And if we take the average composition of all of the soils, all the suspended sediments, and all of the bottom sediments and calculate a similarity index for that, you find that the bottom sediments are actually quite similar to average North American continental soils, whereas the river suspended sediments are much different. So what does that mean? That means that the chemistry of soils is similar to bottom sediments. That means that soils end up as bottom sediments, basically, in rivers. And some fraction of them, obviously, ends up as suspended sediments, but it seems from just this chemical analysis that most of the soils end up as river sediment. And you could look at it as a diagram something like this, where you can see that the soils are eroded to suspended sediment, bottom sediment. The bottom sediment then, of course, develops into floodplains and other types of alluvial deposits. But the question that I want to ask is how much of this bottom sediment, this river floodplain sediment, actually gets delivered to the oceans? I mean, how complete is the rock cycle? How does how at least in modern day times, you know, how complete is the functioning of that rock cycle? Because at least when I think about it, I normally think about soils eroding to the oceans as part of how the rock cycle functions. But how does that actually work today? And to do that, what I want to find is some kind of a chemical signal that can differentiate suspended sediments and bottom sediments. And as we've heard about in many of the talks today, that's quite difficult because if we want to have something that we can compare from the continents to the oceans, we know that in the oceans, many of the chemical signals that are derived from continental particulates get changed through diagenesis of various kinds. So we're looking for refractory elements, and the two that give us the best differentiation of chemistry between river particulates and suspended sediments would be zirconium and hafnium. And that's no surprise to people. People have often used zirconium to aluminum ratios, for example, to look at particle sources. That's not such a surprise, but what I think that is interesting here is we can use it in a specific application, a specific context, in order to differentiate between river particulate and river suspended materials and bottom sediments. And it actually works. So if we look at the zirconium to aluminum ratio of river suspended sediments and compare it to river bottom sediments, you can see that there's very much a different distribution. In this case, the river suspended sediments is not just my database, but also the global database from VIIRS, so there's quite a bit more data there. One thing to note too is that if the dotted line is the crustal average value, and you could see that the river suspended sediments are plotting to the right of the crustal average value. The bottom sediments are plotting, the river suspended to the left, the bottom sediments to the right. So you can see that at least with respect to crustal average, river suspended sediment isn't representing all of what the crust can deliver. But if you look at the river suspended and bottom sediments together, it looks like you get much closer to the crustal average. Unfortunately, zirconium wasn't measured in the sediments from the soils from the USGS database, but it has been measured in Europe. And you can see that if we look at topsoil Europe, zirconium to aluminum ratios, they look very much like river bottom sediments, and floodplain sediments from Europe also do. So that seems to be something universal, I think, that river suspended sediments are much more enriched in zirconium than suspended sediments, which again is not a big surprise. What was a surprise to me, though, was when we looked at when we look at marine sediments, you can see that they look very much like the river suspended load. They look very little like the river bottom sediment load. So, from this, I think we can conclude that it seems that river sediments, that marine sediments, at least in the modern times, are collecting particles from the suspended load and not very much from the river bottom sediments load, implying, of course, that these particles then are being stored on the continents. And again, that's a conclusion that probably wouldn't be too surprising to geomorphologists who look at this in a slightly different way and would probably come up with a similar conclusion. But I like this because it gives us a different way of looking at the problem by looking at marine sediments specifically, and it also might give us a way of looking at this through geologic time. So that's one place that I'll be going in the talk. Well, I wanted to try to quantify this a little bit. So what you can do without getting too technical about it is you can decide that marine sediments are some mix between river sediment and river suspended sediment and river bottom sediment, depending on the frequency distribution of their zirconium to aluminum ratios at different absolute ratios. And I've done that, and then tried to figure out what mix of these values would give us marine sediment. And if I do that, we find that marine sediments, at least those in my database, could be accounted for by 80% of them derived from the suspended load, 20% from bottom sediment, which actually accounts very nicely with independent methods that people have used to try to identify the suspended and bottom sediment load to marine sediments. So today, soils are eroded mainly onto the continents. There's a relatively small portion of soils that are eroded today that actually end up in the oceans. So what about over geologic time? So here I've looked at the SGP database, and I've added about 1,000 analyses that myself and my colleagues at PetroChina have from Mesoproterozoic sediments. And for those that are familiar with this database, it's a wonderful database, but it requires a little bit of attention in some ways. The database, especially for the Phanerozoic, has yet to be curated. So, as it turns out, about 1/3 of the data from the Phanerozoic actually represents riverine and terrestrial sediments. So, I've gone through and done that. I've curated the database to remove those into a separate file, which I'm not showing here, which is also interesting in its own right. But so this is just marine data that we're looking at. And we see some interesting trends. I think that for me, what's striking is that when we look at the Proterozoic until the Neoproterozoic, it seems that the ratio distribution is relatively small. Something seems to happen in the Neoproterozoic, and then there's a bunch of texture to the results when we get into the Phanerozoic, and all of that we're going to try to understand here. When we're thinking about the relatively low spread of ratios in the Proterozoic, there's a variety of different ways that we can try to understand that. If we look on the graph on the right, one could perhaps have something to do with weathering. If weathering rates were lower in the Proterozoic, then we might expect that we have more unweathered rock fragments that are part of the sediment load that's delivered or the riverine sediment load that's delivered to marine sediments, which would give us a lower zirconium to aluminum spread of values. And then, of course, we could have some continental storage. The more continental storage we have, the more the zirconium to aluminum values would shift to lighter values because the continents would tend to be heavier. So that's one way we could do it if we had less weathering. Another way to do it would be if we had, instead of less weathering, just massive erosion. So if during this time, for some reason, which we'll explore in a moment, the erosion was incredibly efficient and violent, that we could imagine that we could also get a relatively narrow spread of zirconium to aluminum ratios in sediments. Of course, with more extensive weathering, then we could imagine we can develop suspended and bottom sediment loads with a more differentiated zirconium to aluminum ratio, giving then us a higher spread of values when we finally look at what's deposited in marine sediments. And then also on that scale, zirconium to aluminum sliding scale, averages which will depend on how much continental storage we have. So why don't we begin with erosion? So one thing that seems to be clear is that when we're dealing before the development of or evolution of land plants, that rivers had a very different type of structure than they do now, at least on average. So before the development of the terrestrial biosphere, rivers were mainly braided rivers, and after the stabilization of the land due to the development of the terrestrial biosphere, then rivers actually started to meander, and you can look at it a little bit like this. The braided river system would be the type of river that apparently dominated pre-Silurian, Devonian, and after that, or after that time, then rivers became meandering as the soils became better stabilized. And meandering rivers are slower rivers, and they have a better opportunity to trap heavy particles. So you could imagine that particle storage might become more important in meandering rivers compared to braided rivers. This could be a contributing factor to the data that we saw, but remember that the shift we saw in high zirconium to aluminum ratios occurred in the Neoproterozoic, not in the Devonian Silurian. So there's something else going on. One thing could be weathering, and Martin Kennedy produced this very interesting study some years ago, where he argued that through the Neoproterozoic, the weathering intensity began to increase quite dramatically, and that by the end of the Neoproterozoic, the clay factory had actually developed. So we're in a position through the transition to the Neoproterozoic where clay weathering became more intense and clay development became more intense. We could imagine as a result of that, we could get a higher spread of zirconium to aluminum ratios. So that actually seems to concord rather nicely with the data that I've shown. But as Martin has shown, and as others have shown, and has also been discussed at the meeting here, diagenetic reverse weathering processes can occur in marine sediments. So the clays that you measure, especially in ancient rocks, may not be representative of the material that actually deposited originally on those rocks. So that maybe there are other indices for weathering that we need to look at. And Bayen did this by looking at the ratio of potassium to aluminum and rubidium to aluminum as weathering indices. These are alkali elements which weather from rock materials, but they weather rather slowly from rock materials, so they can give some nuanced indication of weathering intensity. As we see here, for example, with rubidium to aluminum, what we're looking at is our clays. These are results from river bottom sediments where the clay fraction has been separated out and analyzed. And what we see is that as temperature increases, we get more and more removal of both rubidium and aluminum from the particulates that are represented in the river bottom sediments. So what we're seeing is more intense weathering with increased temperature here. So there is some relationship between temperature and weathering, potassium, aluminum, rubidium, and aluminum, and weathering intensity. Now, when Banyan looked at this over geologic time, they saw that, or argued that sometime around the Cambrian, Precambrian boundary, that there was a change in both the potassium and the rubidium aluminum ratios, which they argued was a result of increasing in atmospheric oxygen, increasing oxygen, providing more intensive oxidative weathering of rock components, and then giving these reduced ratios. Well, the database that we've just looked at is much larger than the Bayen database. And when we look at this database with respect to rubidium to aluminum ratio, and I focus on that because potassium can be impacted more so than rubidium by metasomatism and later diagenetic reactions. So it's probably a little bit more accurate. What we see is that okay, what do we have here? We have the database, and we have a 75-point running average, and a black line just kind of for your to gauge your eye. What we find is that Bayer was right, that we see a decrease in time in the rubidium to aluminum ratio, but that decrease doesn't seem to occur until the Devonian. It doesn't occur earlier than that. So it seems to be coupled to the development of rooted land plants in terrestrial biosphere rather than any increases in atmospheric oxygen. So this weathering indicator comes much later than we might have expected to explain the zirconium to aluminum trends that I just showed. Am I okay with time? How am I doing?
You okay?
Okay.
You have 10 more minutes.
Okay, wonderful. So there's another aspect which I think might be interesting to look at, and that is tectonics. So how might tectonics play into this? And what I'm showing here is a distribution of zircon ages as preserved in all sorts of rocks through geologic time, and there are particular periods in time when we have a high abundance of zircon ages, and there are a variety of reasons which might explain this, but Daumier in 2018 argued that this high abundance of zircon ages through time is related to enhanced rates of subduction. So subduction is then leading to zircon production, and they were arguing that what we're looking at are high rates of zircon production during these particular time periods. And it's not a surprise that they seem to be related to also tectonic events, in particular the development of large supercontinents. So we have a cadence of zircon age distribution which has something to do with tectonics. And why don't we start with the Phanerozoic and then maybe the late Neoproterozoic. When we plot the frequency of zircon ages against the zircon to aluminum ratio, I don't know. I'm an optimist, I guess. I see that there's some kind of trend or relationship here where we have a higher spread of values during times when we tend to have higher zircon, higher frequency of zircon ages, and then a lower spread of zirconium to aluminum ratios when we have a less frequent zircon age distribution. And why might that be true? Well, one way of thinking about it, it could be that with high rates of subduction, which is leading to zircon production, we get also high rates of mountain building. Mountain building then would lead to higher rates of erosion, or at least higher rates of erosion, and maybe a better opportunity for bottom sediment in rivers to wash out into the marine realm. So in my thinking anyway, it could be that what we're dealing with is a tectonic-driven efficiency of particle transfer to the oceans. So the idea being, again, that during times of high tectonic activity, high mountain building, related to high rates of subduction, that we get a more efficient rock cycle. The particles are more efficiently distributed to the oceans. And we actually can have an independent way of looking at that. So if we look at the distribution of zirconium to aluminum ratios through time, starting with the modern marine sediments that we've already talked about, the distribution is to the left of the crustal average value, clear sign for continental storage of particles. But that's also true for the Cenozoic, it's true for the Triassic, it's true for the Silurian, and it's true for the Devonian. So during these particular times in Earth history, we seem to get a distribution of particles which is consistent with massive storage of particles on land during weathering. During the other times, not so much. It looks like the particle transfer to the marine sediments was much more efficient. So if we go back and then line those observations up with the distribution of zircon ages, we can see it kind of fits where during times where the frequency of zircon ages is low, those are also times when independently we see that the storage of particles on continents tends to be high. So there seems to be a tectonic control on this. And of course, this is also related to Wilson cycles, which is part of my title, but we don't need to go into that. So what happens when we take this back into geologic time? Now, if we take it back and we use the interpretation that I just gave to you, we might expect then that the Tonian was a time of massive particle retention on land, because we have the low distribution of zircon ages. And the Mesoproterozoic should also be that, especially before about 11 or 1,200 million years ago, because the distribution of zircon ages is also quite low. So why don't we look at the data and see if that works? Well, for the Tonian, it does. In the Tonian, it looks like the distribution of zircon ages, the frequency distribution, will be compatible with substantial retention of particles on the continent, but not the Mesoproterozoic. That's a very narrow distribution, which is very focused and averaged on the continental average. So there's no evidence for substantial particle retention during the Mesoproterozoic, taken as a big period. Of course, there could be during certain times. So what does this mean? This means that we probably have different processes controlling particle transport to the oceans during Earth history. I would say that during the last billion years of Earth history, tectonics seems to explain particle transport to the oceans and the efficiency of the rock cycle in its operation. But before that, not so much. There's no evidence, for example, that's controlling particle transport to the oceans during the Mesoproterozoic. So there, maybe geomorphology, maybe the braided river systems, maybe rapid erosion transport might be more important in controlling particles, or perhaps lower amounts of weathering, although that doesn't seem to change until much later. So here I leave you with kind of a conclusion, but a big question mark, because I actually haven't been able to figure out what might have happened in 1 billion years to change the nature of particle transport to the oceans, if in fact what I've discussed here is correct. So it seems like something major in the Earth system operation changed at around this time period, whether it was something in tectonics or the process of mountain building or something. I have no idea. But it seems that something changed in how particles are transported in the ocean at about 1 billion years ago. So I guess that's what I wanted to tell you about. It has not much to do with oxygen and life and all that, but hopefully it's something that you find interesting. I do. Also because, you know, we're talking a lot about weathering and CO2 and also the baseline chemistry of particles in the oceans during time, which we use to try to interpret paleo-redox proxies. So all of these things, I think, are coupled very much into the nature and style of particles that are delivered to the oceans, and that seems to be a dynamic through Earth history. So thank you very much for your attention.
We have time for questions. Anyone?
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm going to ask the obvious question. How is it that oxygen doesn't have some part in this?
Okay.
The change in oxygenation.
If I were to give my first talk, I would say that probably there was sufficient oxygen through this time period that we're looking at here to promote extensive oxidative weathering on the continents. So it's earlier we'd have to look at in order to see an oxygen impact.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks for the talk. Just as a point of clarification, how does this story relate, or how does your story relate to in situ weathering in alluvial floodplains? Is that what you think changes, is that what you think changes over time? How do you correlate that or understand that in the fact that when you have in situ weathering, you can then redistribute the elements and then the rivers can double back over and take those things?
What do you mean by in situ weathering? What are you thinking about?
Just generally, you were saying your story was talking a lot about particle size storage,
right.
And you can kind of separate out elements as in different phases. But then, as those larger particles sit in alluvial basins, they're going to be weathered secondarily, and then transported into smaller particles, which then, when the rivers double back, could be brought into the oceans as suspended sediment, sort of transferring them from bed load to suspended load over the kinds of time scales that are like 100,000 year.
That's a good point. That's got to be part of the story. I mean, I actually have a database which I need to analyze more carefully on that interface. You know, the particles that are deposited actually at that interface. So it's an interesting point.
Thank you, Dan, for a very nice talk. I have a question about the pyrite oxidation because I'm kind of worried about how this story, changes in loaded suspended sediment in the river would change the pyrite oxidation delivery to the oceans.
So again, a little bit in answer to your question, if we're thinking about oxidation of pyrite or organic matter or some sort of reduced component, I think there was sufficient oxygen around through this whole time period I'm talking about to promote efficient oxidation of all of these components. As far as I'm aware, there's no real evidence for detrital pyrites during this time window. And we've done separate studies on the preservation of petrographic carbon in marine sediments through this time, and we found that it seems to be rather efficiently oxidized. But it's an interesting point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for a great talk. I was wondering if what type of weathering regime or where you are in the rock cycle would have some effect on the efficiency of organic carbon burial that could actually affect oxygen, right? So is there somewhere in here where maybe you're delivering more suspended load, which is more clays, which would favor organic carbon burial, or is there some link there?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think that's sort of the next step, is to start thinking dynamically in those terms, because obviously during time periods when we are massively depositing particles, we have high sedimentation rates for one thing. We might have more clays being deposited for another thing that could impact. Sure. Great. I agree.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how much of an impact would be to the geomorphology of the deposition environment, where you have broader continental shelves and deltas versus very steep topography and stuff being pushed into the ocean versus more shallow sort of areas.
I think that has to be crucial, I haven't quite cycled all of that. That has to be critical, obviously, in terms of how particles are delivered. Again, luckily, this database, when I've parsed through it, especially through the Phanerozoic, allows me to look at those environments as well. I haven't brought them on board, but yes.
Okay, two more.
Thanks for a really stimulating talk. I'm curious that you see this inflection point associated with Grenville ages in the zircon database. So the zircons produced in that orogeny it's thought to be particularly zircon rich. The zircons are particularly big. There's maybe some oversampling related to that. And I was curious if how you thought about that with the record here.
I haven't. I think that's a great point. Let me think about it. I don't think it's so obvious in this record, to be honest. But there's something like this which I need to think more deeply about. That's an excellent point.
Thank you.
Hi, Don. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I have a thought about the transition at 1 billion years here in terms of controls of particle flux. And that is, what's the role of changes in the thickness of continental lithosphere and continental freeboard over time? That there's some long-term evolution there that might play a role.
Great, thanks. I need to look into a lot of things, but that's a great idea.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, again, thanks to Don again.